part 2 of comparing current NBA players to all-time greats, mainly using multiple players to do so we can hopefully find the most accurate comparison out there. In part 1 we looked at about half of the league's stars, including guys like Steph Curry and LeBron. And for part 2 we're looking at the other half. If you haven't seen part 1 though, go watch it now. But if you already have, enjoy part 2, starting with Klay Thompson, whose all-time comparison is a blend of Chris Mullins and Rip Hamilton. And this one took a while to come up with. There was a ton of shooters to choose from, but we also needed a great defender since Klay is both of those things. But he's not the most athletic and often finds himself as a spot-up shooter, and that's the perfect explanation of Chris Mullins. Rip Hamilton fits the Klay Thompson comparison because he didn't shoot a ton of threes, but when he did, for a lot of his career he was extremely efficient, as well as being one of the better on-ball defenders in the league. So a combination of these two men made perfect sense. Staying on the subject of the Warriors though comes Draymond Green, and Draymond was another tough one to come up with, but we eventually went with the popular comparisons he's received over the years, being Dennis Rodman and Charles Barkley. He's nowhere near as good of a rebounder as either man, but he's got top tier diverse defense like Rodman and a similar offensive style to Barkley. Now he's also nowhere near the scorer Barkley was, but I mean if you combine Barkley's offensive ability with Rodman's, you'd probably end up with something right around Draymond's level. As for Barkley though, Draymond's the slightly better shooter, but both men still did score in similar ways overall. Next is my favorite comparison of the video, and that is that Giannis compares to a cross between Shaq and Scottie Pippen, and I think this one's perfect. I mean, Shaq has already said Giannis is the next Superman, and recently said that Giannis is the modern day version of himself, and again it makes sense. Sure, they don't have similar play styles, but both men have been the most dominant in the league of their times because of their size, and score most of their points in the paint. I mean, if Shaq was transformed into a perimeter player, it would look exactly like Giannis, and combining him with Scottie Pippen would get you there. Scottie wasn't a great shooter, but was one of the best defenders in the NBA, and that's right where Giannis is at right now. So I think both Pippen and Shaq combine perfectly to give you Giannis. Paul George's all-time comparison would then have to be a cross between Scottie Pippen and Tracy McGrady. Now his draft day comparison was just Scottie Pippen because he had great defense, which is still true, and the reason that comparison still stands today. But back then his biggest weaknesses came from the offensive side of his game, and the fact that he's earned a comparison to T-Mac at this point shows just how much he's developed. He's definitely athletic and can score in the paint, but a big part of his offensive game comes from the outside of it, similar to how McGrady played. And George has become one of the better scorers in the league that can create his own shot similar to Tracy, and one of the best one-on-one defenders similar to Scottie Pippen. The comparison for Victor Oladipo was a little tougher though, and another one that was influenced partially by his draft day comparison, which was Tony Allen. And that's the first half of his current comparison, but I guess the other half would have to be D Wade. He's definitely got the defensive ability of Allen, but on offense he's more of a slasher that gets most of his points around the rim, plus has a solid mid-range game. He might not be the offensive player Wade was just yet, but so far he's a lot better than he was from 3. So with all that being said, overall Oladipo's got a pretty similar style to both men. Okay, now this next one's probably going to be controversial, because we have Kawhi Leonard. And a lot of people have turned on Kawhi this year for sitting out a lot of games. But you gotta understand, the man's running a marathon here and not a sprint. And it was something that the Spurs taught him. But that's besides the point. The point is that his all-time comparison is Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. It's a comparison to one of the best defensive players of all time and the greatest player of all time. I get it, but he's got the defense of Pippen, and that's not even arguable. And I'm not saying he's as good of an overall player or even a scorer as Michael Jordan by any means. But honestly, the way that they do score and play is pretty similar. Posting up smaller players, making very little mistakes with the perfect combination of mid-range, threes, and drive into the paint. Might be controversial, but I think this is a good comparison. A perfect comparison in my opinion though goes to Kawhi's former teammate in Pascal Siakam for comparing to Chris Webber and Andrei Kirilenko. And this one's perfect. Kirilenko was a great defender that got most of his points through rim running, scoring off the dribble or on putback dunks, which was how Pascal played up through last season. While Chris Webber has all of those abilities along with the ability to shoot threes, mid-range, post up and score, and the ability to get the ball to open teammates. All abilities Siakam has come out and shown massive improvements on this season. At first this comparison was only going to go to Webber, but eventually adding Kirilenko just seemed like the perfect fit. I will say though, Andre Drummond's all-time comparison wasn't so easy and probably isn't the most accurate, but I do think it's good enough. In 2013, after he was first drafted, people were honestly saying he could be the next Shaq. Now the only thing they have in common today is their rebounding ability and size, with Drummond weighing in at 280 pounds. But the better overall comparison would have to be a blend of Moses Malone and DeAndre Jordan. And it's weird because he's not as good on offense as Moses was, and not as good on defense as DeAndre was. But I mean, honestly, while he's one of the very last traditional centers in the league, he makes it work. He's got the ability to play off the pick and roll and stay open for lobs like Jordan did, and can attack the rim and control rebounds similar to Moses. And as a traditional big man, I think he could still be extremely efficient on a lot of different teams. And finding a comparison for Drummond was tough, but finding one for Zach Lavine was just as hard. And I'll admit, this one's also not too great, but I came up with a blend of the Milwaukee Bucks' Ray Allen and David Thompson. Thompson was a great pure scorer who was one of the most athletic players of his time, which is similar to Zach, while Ray was athletic and could and would shoot the lights out from mid-range and three. Lavine definitely can't shoot as good as Ray can, but they do have a similar combination of inside and out scoring tendencies. So combine all of those things from both players, and because Zach's such a diverse player, I'd say it's as close to as good of a comparison as you can come up with. While on the other hand, Kyle Lowry really only needs one player to compare to, and that's Chauncey Billups. I would have really never thought of this comparison until looking into it, but it makes perfect sense. Neither man was a great athlete, or has been a terrific scorer, never really averaged double-digit assists, or had standout stats in general. But they were the leader of their team and played effectively in similar roles. Billups was a better shooter and leader than Lowry is, but recently Lowry's proved to be the better all-around scorer. Plus, Lowry's played a big role on a championship team, and so did Chauncey. And speaking of Lowry's, Lauri Markkanen's another guy who we found the perfect matchup for. While on draft night his NBA comparison was Nikola Mirotic and Ryan Anderson, I think one even better would be something between Kevin Love, Rashard Lewis, and Ryan Anderson. I mean, his game easily resembles Kevin Love, but he's also much more athletic than him and better at attacking the basket, which is where the Rashard Lewis part comes from. And with how he shoots the ball and can also be a spot-up shooter is where he relates to Anderson. I don't love three-player comparisons, but I feel like for this one, if I would have left any of these three out, it wouldn't have been complete. Then next, we're going to look at one for John Wall, but the John Wall before the injuries and the overpaid contract, just for fun. And this was another tough one. The best I came across without spending hours looking for a better two players was Derrick Rose and Russell Westbrook. He's was as explosive as Derrick Rose, while being a score-first type of player. Athletic like Westbrook, and wasn't a great three-point shooter just like both men, but excelled at attacking the basket, as well as sharing a similar intensity on the defensive end. Now the easiest comparison of the video goes to Trey Young, because he without a doubt falls right in line with a mix between Steph Curry and Steve Nash. The Steph comparisons came in college, even though he said he resembles Nash more, but he's definitely got traits from both men. I mean, Steph and Steve are pretty similar players as is. They were both great shooters that weren't great athletes, but they ran their offense and played just like Trey does now. I would say at this point though, Trey definitely relates more to Steph Curry. He isn't the passer Nash was, at least yet, and is scoring just as much as Steph usually does. For Bradley Beal, he's another guy who only needed one player to compare to, and it was tough to come up with at first. But again, we're going to the Milwaukee Bucks' Ray Allen for this one. I mean, it's weird. Beal plays with such a generic style, and that's not a knock on him, it's just he's like your prototypical NBA shooting guard. Like if you were making a shooting guard in 2K, and for every category give him all moveset number 1, I'm sure they'd come out playing just like Beal. Maybe with an added step back, but for real though, that's why it was tough to really compare him to anyone. But I think with prime Ray Allen's fundamental style, it's a good fit. Then if you combine John Stockton and Isaiah Thomas, you get a player that looked very similar to Chris Paul, who had all the passing ability and defense that Stockton had, and the offensive ability and leadership from Thomas. I mean, Isaiah averaged just about 20 points a game his entire career, and so is CP3, while Paul has also led the league in steals and assists multiple times, and also making multiple all-defensive first teams, very similar to John Stockton. Then Donovan Mitchell wasn't that highly up before the NBA draft, with his comparison being Norman Powell. But since then, he's really transformed his game into being more like a Dwayne Wade type of player. Mitchell's the better shooter and shoots a lot more often than Dwayne did, but how they control the offense and score a majority of their points off drives to the basket is where the resemblance really comes in. Staying on the Utah Jazz though, the Rudy Gay comparison might be a little controversial, because I'm thinking Sean Bradley and Dwight Howard are good fits here. Rudy's got a similar wingspan and length to Sean Bradley, and that was his draft day comparison because of that, and both of their abilities to block shots. But then he's also got a similar overall game to the Orlando Magic Dwight Howard. Now don't get me wrong, that Dwight is by far better than Gobert in every way, but Rudy's like a slightly watered down version of him. They control the paint similar on defense, and on offense played similar roles. Now for the next one, I'm sure a lot of you have never seen Bernard King play, but he was pretty much Carmelo Anthony of the 80s, and it was who he said he really modeled his game after. They were both top tier scorers who had a great mid-range game and excelled at scoring from anywhere on the court, whether it was with their back to the basket, from the 3-point line, or under the rim. Then a combination that made up KarlAnthony Towns took some thinking, because he's got one of the most diverse overall skill sets for a center that we've ever seen. I see a lot of Kevin Garnett and DeMarcus Cousins coming from him though. He can post up nearly just as good as either of them, has the defensive potential that KG had, and can score from the outside just like they both could. I mean, Towns is shooting 42% from 3 right now, which is insane. For his teammate in Andrew Wiggins though, things could go in a couple different ways. I've seen comparisons for him of Vince Carter and Rudy Gay, and other ones of T-Mac and Clyde Drexler. But I think a cross between the two of Clyde and Rudy Gay would give the most accurate representation of the type of player that Andrew is. After his hot start to the year, he's kinda dropped off, but overall he's still got a solid all-around game and a decent jump shot. Speaking of Andrew Wiggins though, he's one half of Brandon Ingram's comparison, with the other half being Kevin Durant. And it's insane how similar he plays to KD now. In his Lakers days, you could see how the comparison made sense, but it wasn't super accurate. But since being on the Pelicans, they're nearly the same player, with how he hits fadeaways and can pull up from anywhere. And there is a little bit of Andrew Wiggins in there too, with how he attacks the rim. But now finally we have the last comparison, and it belongs to Damian Lillard. And this one was tough, but I think we nailed it, with Jay Williams and Gilbert Arenas being who he resembles most. Jay didn't have a very long career in the league at all, but I mean, from his Duke days, you can see that his and Dame's games are almost identical. But then from a shooting and athletic standpoint, I see some, not a ton, but some of Gilbert Arenas with him. And these are two players that really aren't talked about too often for how good they were, so it did take some digging to find this matchup for Lillard. But that's gonna wrap up part 2 of this video. These were pretty fun to make and a switch up from the normal kind of videos that I usually make. So if you did enjoy, let me know by commenting, dropping a like, and as always, don't forget to subscribe.